My name is Sarah, I'm 32 years old, and I've been married to David, 35, for 8 years. We built a life together, an apartment in the city, decent jobs, and everything was supposed to be perfect. I'm an interior designer, and David's a successful marketing executive at a well-known firm. On paper, we looked like the ideal couple, but nothing ever stays perfect, does it? It all came crashing down the day David asked for a paternity test. It started innocently enough. I had been a bit off lately, and David noticed. I'd been quieter, more distant, even though we were still trying to maintain the appearance of a happy couple. Maybe that's why I didn't see the signs coming. The cracks in our marriage had been building, and I was too blind to notice, too wrapped up in my own selfish affairs. The day it happened was supposed to be normal. I had just returned from a business trip to New York, a quick, 3-day affair to meet with clients. I was exhausted but excited to get back home to David. When I walked through the door, I could tell something was different. The air felt thick, tense. I thought it was just me, tired from travel. But no, David was standing in the living room, his face twisted in frustration, holding a piece of paper in his hand. "Sarah, we need to talk." I stopped in my tracks. The tone of his voice sent chills down my spine. This wasn't a conversation I was prepared to have. "About what?" I asked, trying to play it cool. But inside, my heart was racing. I had a sinking feeling, as if my entire world was about to fall apart. He handed me the paper without saying a word. It was a letter from a fertility clinic, stating that the paternity of our son, our 5-year-old son, Noah, needed to be confirmed through a DNA test. I froze. "David, what is this?" I stammered, looking at him with wide eyes. His face was pale, his voice steady, but the hurt in his eyes was undeniable. "I've been thinking about this for a while, Sarah. You've been acting distant lately, and I don't know what to think, but I have to know. Is Noah really my son?" I blinked, disbelief flooding my senses. "Are you serious right now? How could you?" David interrupted, his voice rising. "You've been gone a lot lately, Sarah, and don't tell me I haven't noticed. The late nights, the secrecy with your phone, the weird excuses when you said you were working late. I have every right to know. I need to know if Noah is mine." A sickening realization hit me like a ton of bricks. He suspected something. He was implying that I had cheated. And suddenly, everything started to make sense. The late nights, the distance, the moments when I caught him staring at me, as if he could see right through me. I could feel the anger building inside of me. How dare he? After everything we've been through, after the life we've built, he thought I would betray him? My hands trembled as I held the paper, the words becoming a blur. "David, how dare you suggest that I cheated on you?" I shouted, my voice trembling with fury. "I have been nothing but faithful to you." His gaze didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "Don't act like I'm the crazy one here, Sarah. I have to know the truth." The word stung. I had never felt so insulted in my life. But there was more, much more. "Are you trying to tell me that you think I couldn't even finish the sentence, my heart racing as the fury consumed me. David, completely calm, added, "Yes, I do. And if Noah isn't mine, then I'm going to have to reconsider everything. This marriage, our life, everything." That was it. That was the breaking point. My stomach twisted in knots. I had to defend myself. I had to defend my family, but the anger, the betrayal I felt was overwhelming. I had been caught, in my own lie, in my own web of deceit, and I didn't even know how to explain myself. I couldn't. David wasn't just asking for a paternity test, he was accusing me of something far worse. I had cheated on him. And worse still, I was caught. That business trip to New York wasn't just a business trip. It was the moment I let my guard down and crossed a line I would regret forever. See, on that trip, I met someone. His name was Mark, 38 years old, tall, charming, and someone I never planned on getting involved with. It was supposed to be a one-time thing, a fleeting moment of indulgence in the anonymity of a city that never sleeps. But one thing led to another, and I found myself tangled in a passionate affair with him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't intentional. But in that moment, when I thought my marriage was falling apart, I convinced myself it didn't matter. Until now. Mark, he wasn't even on my mind. But David had pieced it together. And now, it was all crashing down. As the reality set in, I felt a cold wave of panic. How could I ever make this right? Would he ever look at me the same way again? Would I lose everything, my family, my life, everything we built? David didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, holding the paper, knowing that everything was about to change. And in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this tear me apart. No, I would fight back. There was no way I was going to let him think I was some sort of cheat without a fight. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. I didn't know what to expect when David left that night, but I sure as hell wasn't expecting what happened next. My emotions were a whirlwind: anger, betrayal, guilt, all fighting for control over me. But underneath it all, there was one thing I knew for sure: I had to get ahead of this. The next day, I couldn't sleep. I was up at 5 a.m., my mind racing, thoughts colliding in a chaotic mess. I had no idea how I was going to explain myself to David, but there was no way I was going to let him think I was the villain in this story. My pride wouldn't allow it. He was wrong, and I needed to make him see that. But first, I needed to know what was really going on in his head. I decided to call him. It had been a sleepless night, and I was now fully prepared to confront him head-on, armed with every argument I could muster. But when I called, the words I was planning to say, pleading, begging, demanding that he understand, caught in my throat. Instead, I heard something that stopped me cold. Hello? It was Mark. I froze. I hadn't expected to hear from him. Why was he calling me now? Mark, I asked, my voice shaky. What do you want? What's going on? I can't talk right now. David and I are dealing with something. Mark was quiet for a moment, and then, with an odd sense of calmness, he replied, listen, Sarah, I need you to know something. This isn't just about David. There's something else going on, something you don't know. And it's going to change everything. I was confused. What are you talking about? He took a deep breath. I wasn't just sleeping with you, Sarah. I didn't just make a mistake. David knows about us. He knows what happened in New York. And he's not upset with you for cheating. He's upset because of what he's learned about himself. My heart dropped. What do you mean? What has he learned? Mark paused again. He's been tested, Sarah. Not just for paternity, but for something else. Something much more shocking. I was speechless. What do you mean? What test? You're scaring me, Mark. Mark exhaled slowly. David's been hiding something for years, and it's going to destroy your marriage. The paternity test was just the beginning, but what he's really concerned about is his real father. I felt my chest tighten. What did that even mean? What are you talking about, Mark? This is crazy. Is this some sort of game to you? Mark's tone softened, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. I'm sorry, Sarah. But you need to know the truth. David wasn't always David. His real father is someone else, someone you've known for a long time. At this point, I was utterly confused and completely panicked. What do you mean? Who? I could hear Mark struggling with his words. You won't believe it, but David's biological father is actually your ex, Ethan. Ethan, my ex from years ago, the man I thought I'd left behind. I couldn't breathe. This was insane. How could David not have known this? How could Ethan have been involved in all of this? I had never imagined for a second that my ex, the man I'd been in love with before I met David, could have any connection to David's life. The two were supposed to be completely separate. How do you know this? I whispered, my mind spinning. Mark's voice was grim. I'm not supposed to know, but I've been investigating. David and Ethan's past is messy, Sarah. Your husband doesn't even know the full truth about it. I've been trying to warn you, but now it's too late. I felt the walls closing in. I didn't know what was real anymore. My entire life was starting to unravel, piece by piece, and I couldn't stop it. I have to go, Mark added, his voice suddenly sounding distant. Just know that you're not the only one who's been betrayed. But you'll need to decide soon, whether or not you want to know the full truth. The line went dead, and I stood there, holding the phone, my legs weak beneath me. Ethan, of all people, how could this be happening? I didn't know what to do with this new information. How was it possible that David didn't know this? How had Ethan been involved in his life? What did this mean for our family, for Noah? Everything I thought I knew about David's past was now in question. I had never known about this hidden connection between David and Ethan. For hours, I couldn't think straight. I couldn't even look at Noah, my son, without wondering if everything I thought was real was actually a lie. If David's entire identity was built on a lie. By the time David came home that night, I had barely moved from my spot on the couch. My mind was a blur, and every part of me was shaking, torn between the anger I felt toward David for questioning me and the crushing realization that the man I married might not be the man I thought he was. David didn't say anything when he walked in. He just stood there, staring at me as if he was waiting for me to make the first move. But I didn't have anything to say to him, not yet. Sarah, he finally spoke, breaking the silence. I know you're angry, I know you're hurt, but I need answers. I need to know if Noah is mine. David, I said, my voice shaking. You don't need a paternity test. You need to talk to Ethan. His face paled, and he stepped back. What do you mean? What does Ethan have to do with this? I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. It was time for the truth to come out. You need to talk to him, David. You need to know what he's been hiding from you. It's all tied together. David stared at me, confusion crossing his face. What are you talking about, Sarah? I didn't answer. Instead, I turned away, the weight of my decision hitting me. This was going to get so much worse before it could get better. But there was no going back. Not anymore. And that, my friends, was when the real drama began. I spent the next few days pacing around the house like a caged animal, trying to process everything I had just learned. My mind was flooded with anger, betrayal, and confusion. My marriage was falling apart right before my eyes, and what made it worse was that I didn't even know where to turn for answers. Ethan, David, Mark, everyone had their secrets, and now it felt like I was stuck in the middle of a nightmare I didn't know how to wake up from. But I wasn't going to let this destroy me. No, I wasn't just going to stand there and let David accuse me of things I hadn't done, while all along, he had his own dirty laundry to deal with. If he thought he could tear our family apart by questioning my loyalty, then he was going to regret it. I wasn't the kind of woman who would just roll over and take it. I was going to fight back, only this time. I was going to play the game differently. It was time for my revenge. I started with one simple question: how far was I willing to go to make David feel what I was feeling? I wasn't just hurt. I was humiliated, and I couldn't let him walk away from this without a taste of the pain he had caused me. I didn't trust Mark completely. After all, he was the one who had been sleeping with me while all of this was going on, but there was no denying that he had provided me with a crucial piece of information. Ethan, David's biological father. That was the one thing that kept gnawing at my mind. How could I use this to my advantage? I didn't have to think too hard. The answer was right in front of me. I had always hated the way David treated me, like I was the one who had caused all the damage. He had his own skeletons in the closet, and I was going to make sure he paid for them. The first step in my plan was simple: get Ethan involved. He was the key to breaking David. He didn't even know it, but he had a part to play in this twisted little drama that had become my life. So, I called him. I'd been avoiding Ethan for years. I had tried to bury my past with him, tried to put him in the rearview mirror and move on with my life. But now, I needed him, whether I liked it or not. It took a few rings before he picked up. Sarah? His voice was cautious, but I could tell he recognized my number. What's going on? Do you remember David? I asked, my voice cold and steady. You know, your son. There was a pause, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. I thought you two were done with that. What do you need from me? I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation. You're his father, Ethan. I need you to come clean about it. There was a long silence. I could hear him breathe on the other end, and I knew he was trying to figure out what I was getting at. Sarah, he finally said, this is insane. David has no idea about me, and I don't know if it's the right time. It's not about the right time, Ethan, I snapped. It's about you taking responsibility. I can't carry the burden anymore. You've been a ghost in David's life long enough. It's time for you to face the music. He deserves the truth. There was a tension that settled between us, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope. This was my chance to set everything in motion. If David was going to break me down, I wasn't going to let him do it without a fight. Fine, Ethan said, his voice resigned. I'll be there, but this isn't going to be easy. I know, I said, my voice firm. But it's the only way forward. We both have to face the truth. After hanging up, I spent the next few hours getting myself ready. There was no turning back now. David was going to lose everything: his identity, his trust in me, and perhaps even his sanity. If he thought he could humiliate me and accuse me of cheating, then he was in for a shock. I was about to destroy everything he thought he knew about his own life. As I sat in my living room, waiting for Ethan to arrive, my mind began to race again. What if David didn't believe me? What if he refused to listen? The thought of him not trusting me, of him clinging to his delusions, made my stomach churn. But this was bigger than me. It wasn't just about me proving my innocence anymore. It was about David's entire existence coming crumbling down. The doorbell rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Ethan had arrived. I opened the door to see him standing there, looking exactly as I remembered him: tall, dark hair, a rugged face that had grown older with time but still carried the same intensity. The years hadn't been kind to him, but I didn't care. He was here now, and that's all that mattered. What do we do now? I asked, trying to keep my voice even, despite the whirlwind of emotions brewing inside me. We tell him the truth, Ethan replied, his voice steady, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It's the only way to fix this mess. I nodded, and together, we walked into the living room. Ethan sat down on the couch, his hands gripping the edges as if he were about to face the firing squad. I sat opposite him, trying to steady my nerves. As I waited for David to walk in, I realized that everything I had done up until this point was leading to this very moment. It wasn't just about the revenge anymore. It was about making sure that David understood the magnitude of the pain he had caused. It was about turning the tables. When David walked through the door, I could see the shock in his eyes when he saw Ethan sitting there. "What's this about?" David asked, his voice tense, his face hard. "Ethan's here because he needs to tell you something," I said, leaning forward. "David, everything you thought you knew about yourself, about your family, has been a lie. You deserve to know the truth." David's eyes shifted between me and Ethan, confusion and anger battling on his face. "What the hell is going on here, Sarah? What did you do?" But I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I nodded to Ethan, signaling that it was his turn to speak. Ethan took a deep breath, then said the words that would shatter David's world. "David, I'm your father." And just like that, the bombshell dropped. "For oh Minnie, you said, now write part 4 as long as possible," ChatGPT said. Part 4 revenge plays out. The moment Ethan spoke, I could see the color drain from David's face. It was almost as if time itself had stopped. I knew what he was thinking. The world he had built, his identity, his memories, everything he had known about himself, was crashing down in a single breath. I could almost hear the frantic noise in his head, the doubt, the panic, the disbelief. I didn't care. In fact, seeing him struggle with the weight of the truth was almost satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. He had torn me apart for months, accusing me of things I hadn't done, questioning my loyalty, and treating me like I was the one who was destroying everything. But now, here he was, standing at the center of his own shattered reality. David's voice cracked as he tried to process what Ethan had just said. "This is insane. This is a joke, right? Ethan, you're not my father." His words were desperate, a plea for the truth to somehow be different. But Ethan stood firm. "I didn't know about you until a few years ago, David. I'm sorry for not being there, but I'm your father. I had no idea until recently, but now that I know, I want to do the right thing." David stood frozen, his eyes wide, his body stiff, as though the news had paralyzed him, and I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. I had won. "You're lying," David finally muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "My whole life, this doesn't make sense. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Why didn't anyone say anything?" I could see his confusion shift to anger, the blame shifting away from me and towards Ethan. But I wasn't about to let him off the hook. Not now. Not after everything he had done to me. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "You never cared to ask, David. You just took everything at face value. Your whole life has been built on lies, and you never once questioned it." David's gaze shifted to me, and I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He finally understood. I wasn't just here to destroy him, I was here to force him to face the consequences of his actions. And now, with the truth about his parentage hanging in the air, he could no longer pretend to be the man he had been. His voice wavered as he asked, "Why did you do this, Sarah? Why did you bring him here? Why couldn't you just let it go?" I stood up slowly, my eyes never leaving his face. "You don't get to ask me that question, David. You don't get to play the victim after everything you've done. You wanted a paternity test. You wanted to tear apart my life and accuse me of cheating. You wanted to destroy me, to ruin everything we had. And now read the one who has to face the truth." David looked like he was about to say something more, but his voice faltered. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then took a step back, his eyes darting between Ethan and me. I don't know what to say. There was nothing left for him to say. The truth had been laid bare, and in the quiet that followed, I saw something shift in him. It wasn't guilt or regret, at least not yet. It was fear. Fear of losing everything, of his world crumbling to dust. Ethan looked at me and then back at David, his voice gentle but firm. "David, you're my son, and it's time for you to accept that. I may not have been there when you were growing up, but that doesn't mean I don't care. I'll be here now, no matter what." David's face twisted with a mix of anger and confusion, but I saw something else in his eyes, something darker, more dangerous. This wasn't over. He wasn't just going to walk away, especially not when he was caught in the middle of his own personal disaster. I wasn't naive enough to think that he would just accept the truth and move on. No, I knew he was going to retaliate. He was going to fight back with everything he had, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. But this was my victory, and even if he tried to destroy me in return, I would be ready. I had already planned for the aftermath, knowing full well that David wouldn't just let it go. The next step was crucial, and I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers. But before I could say anything more, David's voice broke the silence. "You've ruined everything, Sarah," he spat, his words full of venom. "You think you're some kind of hero in this? You think you've won? You've just destroyed everything I've worked for. My whole life is a lie now. I don't even know who I am anymore." I couldn't help the smug grin that pulled at my lips. "You're right about one thing, David. You've lost everything, but you haven't lost it all yet." He looked at me, confused, desperate to understand my meaning. "I told you," I continued, leaning in, "you don't get to play the victim anymore. You have to live with what you've done. All those lies, all the accusations, now they come back to haunt you." David's face darkened. "What are you planning to do? You think I'll just roll over and let you get away with this?" "Trust me, David," I said, my voice low and steady. "You're going to wish you never asked for that paternity test." I turned and walked toward the door, but before I could reach the handle, David rushed forward, blocking my path. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" I paused, looking at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. "No, David. This is just the beginning." With that, I walked out of the room, leaving David to stew in the chaos he had created. But I wasn't finished with him. Not by a long shot. In the days that followed, I set my plan into motion, making sure that every piece fell into place. I contacted Mark, telling him about David's breakdown, and we discussed our next steps. I didn't know how far I was willing to go, but I knew this was going to get even uglier. David's world was crumbling, and I wasn't about to let him rebuild it. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about power, and I was going to make sure he knew exactly who was in control. The aftermath was just beginning. The days that followed felt like a surreal blur, a whirlwind of emotions, half-truths, and whispered conversations. I had thought I was prepared for the fallout, but nothing could have truly prepared me for the damage that was about to unfold. David was spiraling, his every move laced with bitterness, resentment, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that only a shattered identity could breed. But what truly surprised me was how quickly his anger turned into something darker, something I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't expected him to retaliate with such force. The first signs of his desperation came when he showed up at my door late one night. His face was red, eyes wild with rage, as though the world was closing in around him. He was practically shaking, like a wild animal trapped in a cage. "Sarah," he yelled, his voice breaking, "I want you to fix this. I want you to make everything go back to the way it was." I stared at him, unmoved. The audacity of him to come here, to demand something from me, was almost laughable. I stood there in the doorway, arms crossed, as I let him finish his tirade. I wanted him to say everything he needed to say so I could watch the reality of his situation sink in, piece by piece. "Do you know what you've done to me, to my life?" David's voice was raw, desperate, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. "You've ruined everything. My relationship with Ethan, my place in this family. You think you can just destroy me and walk away like nothing happened?" I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady and calm. "No, David. You did this to yourself. You set this whole thing in motion when you decided to accuse me of things I didn't do, when you chose to lie, when you put your own pride above everything else. I didn't destroy you, you did." His eyes flickered with something that almost resembled guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anger that simmered underneath. He was at war with himself, unsure of whether to lash out at me or seek my forgiveness. But there would be no forgiveness. Not from me. Not anymore. "I never meant for any of this to happen," David said, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to destroy our family. I didn't want to hurt you." "Too late for apologies, David," I replied coldly, stepping away from him. "You can't take back what's been done." But he wasn't ready to back down. "Not yet." "I want you to fix this," David said again, more forcefully this time. "Make Ethan go away. Make him disappear. You don't want him in your life, right? We can still salvage something here. You just have to tell him to leave, to stop coming around." A chill ran down my spine. It was a threat, a subtle one, but a threat nonetheless. His words were layered with the promise of destruction, and I realized how far he was willing to go to reclaim control over his own shattered world. He wanted me to erase Ethan. He wanted to feel powerful again. And in that moment, I knew I had to make a decision. "I'm not going to play your game, David," I said firmly. "You can't bully me into doing what you want. You can't rewrite this story." He glared at me, but I didn't flinch. In fact, I found a strange kind of strength in his anger. He was showing his hand. He was exposing exactly how much he was willing to sacrifice just to win back the little bit of control he had lost. And I had no intention of giving him any power over me. "You're making a mistake," David warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You're pushing me too far. I don't think you've ever understood what I've been through." "David," I said, my voice cutting through the tension in the air, "you think this is about revenge, but it's not. It's about standing up for myself. It's about not letting you manipulate me anymore." He stared at me, seething, but then, as if he finally understood, he turned and stormed off without another word. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. It was over. David was done. He was no longer the man I had once known, the man I had been married to. He was someone else now, someone twisted by his own insecurities and fragile ego. And the person standing in front of me wasn't worth my time, my energy, or my sympathy. Over the next few weeks, the pieces of the aftermath began to fall into place. David, in his desperation, started to spread rumors. He told people that I had cheated, that Ethan was the cause of everything that went wrong. He tried to paint me as the villain, but the truth was already out. It was too late for him to rewrite the story. Ethan stood by me, unwavering in his support. He knew that this was my battle to fight, and he was there when I needed him. We spent time together, talking, rebuilding what had been broken, but I knew it was never going to be the same again. I would never be the same again. And then there was the matter of Ethan's relationship with David. The moment David had learned the truth, everything shifted. I wasn't the only one he had been lashing out at. Ethan, too, became his target. But unlike me, Ethan wasn't willing to be manipulated or controlled. He stood his ground, refusing to let David push him around. But as the days passed, I began to notice something unsettling. David's anger seemed to intensify. He would show up at the house uninvited, banging on the door, demanding to see Ethan, demanding to talk things through. At first, I didn't let him in, but soon, it became clear that he wasn't going to back off. I knew what had to be done. One evening, I arranged for a final confrontation. I didn't want to leave anything unresolved. I had to make it clear once and for all that I was done with him. I wasn't going to let him keep twisting the narrative. This had to end. When David showed up, he was angrier than I had ever seen him. He barged into the house, his fists clenched, his face red with fury, but I wasn't afraid. I was ready. "You think you've won, don't you?" David shouted. "You think you've taken everything from me? Well, I'm not done yet." I looked at him, my eyes steady, my resolve unwavering. "No, David, you're done." He froze. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. And in that moment, I realized something. I had won. It wasn't about revenge or winning the fight. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, my future. I wasn't going to let him control me anymore. David didn't say another word. He turned and left the house, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. And just like that, it was over. There was no grand final battle, no explosive confrontation. Just the quiet, simple realization that I was free. Free from the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. I had rebuilt myself, piece by piece, and now, I could move on. Ethan and I, though scarred, were finally able to look ahead. The past was behind us, and we had a future to build. Together. David was a part of my past, a reminder of how far I had come, but he no longer had the power to affect my future. And as for the aftermath, it was simply the peace that came from knowing the truth, and the strength that grew from facing the lies head on.